It was just another quiet morning. A homeless black man sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, wrapped in an old coat, silent, tired. Moments later, a white police officer pulled up, saw him, and decided he didn't belong there. No questions, no warning, just cuffs. The man didn't fight. He didn't even raise his voice. But what the officer didn't know was that this so-called homeless man wasn't who he seemed. He was the new chief of police, undercover, watching. And the moment that officer tightened those handcuffs, he made the biggest mistake of his career. What happens next will shock the entire department, shake the city, and finally expose the truth no one wanted to see. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. The air was cold that morning, the kind that pressed against the skin and made everything feel still. Officer Rickson sat inside his patrol car, fingers tapping against the steering wheel, frustrated by the quiet shift. He didn't enjoy slow mornings. He wanted action, something to break the boredom and remind the department he was still sharp, still ready. His eyes swept the street like a hunter, and then he saw him, an older man curled up on a bench outside the courthouse. His coat was worn and oversized, pulled tight around his body, and a shopping cart sat beside him, full of bags, blankets, and empty cans. To Rickson, he was just another homeless man who didn't belong there. Rickson stepped out of the car, heavy boots striking the sidewalk. His voice was firm before he even reached the bench. "Get up," he ordered, standing tall, hands on his belt. The man stirred slowly under the coat. Rickson nudged the bench with his foot. "I said get up. You can't sleep here." The man sat up, adjusting his hood. His name was Jerome. He looked about 60, maybe older. His beard was salt and pepper, and his hands were rough and scarred. His eyes were tired but sharp. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at Rickson, silent and still. "You got ID?" Rickson asked, his voice already carrying the tone of someone expecting trouble. Jerome shook his head calmly. "I'm not bothering anyone. I just needed a place to rest." Rickson's jaw tightened. He had already made up his mind. No ID? That meant danger. No home? That meant disrespect. And a black man sleeping outside a government building? That was enough in Rickson's eyes. "Stand up," he snapped. Jerome didn't argue. He moved slowly, rising to his feet with effort. His knees cracked as he stood, but his face stayed calm. Rickson grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back without warning. "You're being detained for trespassing and refusing to identify yourself," he said, pulling out the cuffs. Jerome didn't resist. He just looked over his shoulder and said, "You're making a mistake." Rickson gave a short laugh. "Yeah, they all say that." He clicked the handcuffs shut and led Jerome toward the patrol car. A woman across the street stopped walking. Her name was Tanya. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Rickson noticed her but didn't care. Let them watch. Let them film. He was sure this arrest would stick. Back at the station, Rickson marched Jerome past the front desk, talking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Found him camped out like it's a damn motel. Wouldn't show ID. Looked like he was casing the building." The desk officer, Brian, looked up from his computer. He stared at Jerome for a moment, then furrowed his brow. Jerome looked around the room like he recognized it, like he had walked those halls before. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. There was something quiet in his presence that didn't fit the image of a man in cuffs. Rickson kept talking, proud of himself. "You know how it is, Brian. Can't let these guys loiter around the courthouse. Next thing you know, they're sleeping in the lobby." Jerome turned his head slightly and looked at Officer Brian. His voice was low but clear. "Call Deputy Chief Evelyn. Tell her I'm here. Tell her who brought me in." Brian blinked. "What?" Rickson frowned. "Who the hell do you think you are giving orders?" Jerome didn't even look at him. "Just make the call," he said softly. "It'll save you time." Rickson shook his head, laughing. "You're crazy. You don't tell me what to do." But Brian had already picked up the phone. Brian's fingers hesitated over the phone for a second before dialing. He wasn't sure what was happening, but something in Jerome's voice had shifted the air around them. Rickson rolled his eyes and leaned against the counter, still smirking. "Go ahead. Call whoever you want. I've got the whole thing on body cam. We'll see how long your attitude lasts when you're sitting in a cell. Brian spoke quietly into the phone, asking to be connected to Deputy Chief Evelyn. There was a pause, then a longer one. His expression changed slowly, from confusion to concern. Rickson noticed it but brushed it off. What, is she busy? Tell her it's urgent. We've got a trespasser who thinks he's royalty. Brian didn't answer him. He kept listening, nodding slowly, his face growing more tense with each word. Then he glanced up at Jerome, really looked at him, and something clicked in his eyes. He held the receiver away from his ear and said, "She wants to talk to you." He didn't mean Rickson. He meant Jerome. Rickson's smirk faded. What? Brian ignored him and handed the phone through the glass. Jerome took it in his cuffed hands, calm as ever. "It's me," he said simply. A pause, then a soft nod. "Yeah, just like I said it would happen." Another pause. No, don't send a car. Let's give him a minute to figure it out on his own." Jerome handed the phone back and turned toward Rickson. "You've still got time to fix this," he said quietly. Rickson's brow furrowed. "You think I'm scared because you called some friend at the top?" he snapped. "You're still in cuffs. You're still nobody." But his voice didn't carry the same confidence as before. Brian stood up from behind the desk. "Rickson, you need to uncuff him. Now." Rickson laughed, half confused, half irritated. "Are you serious?" Brian nodded firmly. "That man you dragged in here is Interim Chief Jerome Langston. He's the one leading the internal review." Evelyn confirmed it. "He's been undercover evaluating how officers handle situations like this." Rickson's face dropped. Every word hit him like a blow. "What?" "He's homeless." Brian's stare didn't waver. Number. He just knew the only way to see how we treat people on the bottom was to stand where they stand. Rickson looked back at Jerome, who hadn't moved, who hadn't raised his voice once. Jerome extended his cuffed hand slightly. "You want to finish what you started, or do you want to fix your mistake?" His voice was still even, still calm. Rickson stood frozen, suddenly unsure of everything, his badge, his power, his future. The room was silent, and for the first time since the arrest, Rickson had no idea what to do next. Rickson's hands hovered near his belt, unsure whether to reach for the key or double down. The silence in the room was thick, and even the usual background chatter of the station had faded. Jerome stood quietly, not forcing anything, just waiting. Brian stepped around the desk slowly, his voice low but firm. "Unlock him, Rickson! Now!" There was no room for argument in his tone. Rickson clenched his jaw, trying to process everything. His eyes darted from Jerome to Brian, then back to Jerome again. "This some kind of test?" he muttered. "You're telling me this guy right here, is the chief?" He didn't want to believe it. It didn't make sense. In his mind, chiefs wore stars on their collars and crisp suits, not ragged coats and worn-out shoes. Jerome didn't answer. He just stood there, still cuffed, still calm. The quiet was louder than anything Rickson had heard all morning. Finally, with a hand that trembled slightly, Rickson pulled out the key. He stepped forward slowly, the weight of his mistake crawling up his spine. As he unlocked the cuffs, the click sounded louder than it should have, sharp and final. Jerome rubbed his wrist briefly, then looked Rickson in the eye. "Do you know why I didn't tell you who I was?" Rickson didn't answer. He couldn't. Jerome's voice was steady, low, but it carried weight. "Because I wanted to see how far you go. I wanted to know how you treat people who have nothing. No name, no title, just skin and silence." Rickson backed up a step, his pride slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. I thought you were just—" He stopped himself. The sentence sounded worse in his head than it had out loud. He couldn't finish it. Jerome nodded once. "Exactly, you thought." Deputy Chief Evelyn arrived moments later, stepping through the station doors with sharp, fast footsteps. Her eyes went straight to Jerome. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded once. "I'm fine, but we've got a bigger problem than we thought." Then he turned toward Rickson again. "This wasn't about me. You don't know how lucky you are that this didn't happen to someone who couldn't defend themselves later." Evelyn's voice was sharper now. "Officer Rickson, you're to report to Internal Affairs immediately. Badge and weapon, hand them over." The words struck like a punch. Rickson didn't move. For a second it looked like he might argue. But then he looked at Jerome, really looked, and all the words he wanted to say vanished. With stiff hands, he unhooked his badge and set it on the desk. The gun followed. The weight of the metal on the counter felt like the end of something he hadn't realized was so fragile. Jerome didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched, silent again, as Rickson stood there, stripped of the power he had used so carelessly just an hour ago. And the worst part for Rickson was this. Jerome hadn't done a thing to fight back. He didn't need to, because the truth had done it for him. The walk from the front desk to the Internal Affairs office felt longer than any street Rickson had ever patrolled. Each step echoed in his ears like a reminder of what he'd just lost. The hallway, once familiar, now felt foreign, like it no longer belonged to him. Officers he passed didn't meet his eyes. Some looked away, others whispered quietly. The silence that followed him was worse than any confrontation. Inside the small office, a plain desk and 2 chairs waited. Sergeant Devlin, head of Internal Affairs, sat with a thick file open in front of him. His expression gave nothing away. "Have a seat," he said without looking up. Rickson lowered himself slowly into the chair, trying not to let his nerves show, but the tightness in his shoulders betrayed him. Devlin turned a page. "So, a homeless man sleeping on a bench outside the courthouse." He looked up, eyes cold. "Didn't look familiar to you?" Rickson said nothing. Devlin didn't wait for an answer. "Because that man wasn't just your superior. He was the one assigned to evaluate field conduct. Your conduct." Rickson opened his mouth, searching for something. An excuse. A defense, anything. "I thought he was—" Devlin cut him off. "You thought he was what? A nobody? A threat? Less than you?" Rickson flinched. The words hit harder now that there was no badge to hide behind. "I was following protocol," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. Devlin leaned forward. "You cuffed a man who wasn't resisting. You ignored his right to explain. You mocked him. You filed a false report before even running his name." He dropped the file on the desk. "And this isn't the first time, is it?" Rickson's head lifted slightly. "What are you talking about?" Devlin opened another folder. Complaint forms. Dozens. None had reached the press. Most had been closed quietly, handled internally, but now they were all being reopened. "You've had a history, Rickson. Excessive stops, aggressive tone, selective enforcement. You've been warned more than once, and every time someone covered for you. Not anymore." Rickson's face grew pale. This wasn't just about today. This was everything catching up at once. "You can't fire me without a hearing," he said weakly. Devlin raised an eyebrow. "You'll get your hearing, and a suspension while we prepare for it." He stood. "But understand this. You didn't get caught because you made a mistake. You got caught because the man you underestimated didn't stay silent." Rickson stood slowly, but it felt different now. Without his badge, without authority, he was just another man in the hallway, another name in a file. As Devlin motioned for him to leave, Rickson turned toward the door. And this time, nobody watched him with respect, only with quiet disbelief at how fast things had changed. Rickson walked out of Internal Affairs with a paper in his hand and fire in his chest. The suspension notice was clear. 30 days without pay pending investigation. But it wasn't just the paper that burned him. It was the looks. The way every officer avoided his eyes now. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room. He had spent years building his reputation in that station. Tough, direct, never afraid to push limits. And now it all felt like a trap he'd walked into blind. He stormed out the back exit of the precinct, not wanting to face the watch commander or anyone else. His car was still parked where he'd left it earlier that morning, and as he opened the door and sat down, the silence inside felt heavier than it had before. He stared at the wheel, gripping it tightly, jaw clenched, trying to steady his thoughts. This was supposed to be just another shift, another routine sweep. Instead, he'd arrested the most powerful man in the department and humiliated himself in front of half the station. His phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the patrol officers, Dale. "You okay, man? Whole place is talking. Thought you should know. Someone leaked the footage." Rickson's heart dropped. He opened the video attachment. It was short, only a minute and a half. Tanya's phone footage, shot from across the street. It showed him yanking Jerome up from the bench, cuffing him hard without resistance, pushing him into the patrol car like he was trash. Rickson's own voice rang clear over the shaky audio, sarcastic, mocking. "You're not special. Get in the car before I give you a reason to scream." He watched it twice, then 3 times. Every time it hit harder. The internet wouldn't need a trial. They had already seen enough. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat and leaned back, pressing his hands over his face. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had handed them everything they needed to bury him. His arrogance, his tone, the way he never paused to ask a single real question. And Jerome, that man never raised his voice once. That was the part Rickson couldn't get out of his head. Not once. No anger, no shouting, just stillness. Like he had expected it all to happen. And maybe he had. Rickson sat in the car for almost an hour, not moving, just replaying everything in his mind. Every decision, every word. He thought about the warnings, about the training he had dismissed, about the rookie officers who had hesitated before following his lead, and how he used to laugh it off, calling them soft. And now the ones who had stayed quiet were the ones keeping their badges. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. Police officer suspended after wrongful arrest of interim chief. Internal Affairs opens full review. Civil rights advocates respond. His picture was on the front page. Rickson exhaled sharply and punched the steering wheel, hard enough to make his knuckles sting. But there was no satisfaction in the pain. It was too late for that. Back inside the station, Jerome stood in the hallway outside the chief's office, speaking quietly with Evelyn. His coat was off now, and his posture carried a quiet strength. Officers passed him with subtle nods, some out of respect, others out of regret. They knew what had happened, and they knew it wouldn't end here. Jerome glanced toward the exit, as if he could still feel Rickson's presence. Even though he was gone, his voice remained calm. "We're not done," he told Evelyn. "That man was just the surface. I want every report, every file he touched, every name that filed a complaint and never heard back." Evelyn nodded. "You'll have them." Jerome looked back down the hallway, eyes sharp. This isn't about punishing one man. It's about exposing the system that let him get this far. And for the first time in years, the station walls felt like they were listening. That evening, the station's atmosphere shifted from quiet tension to something sharper, uneasy and restless. The weight of what had happened was spreading fast, not just inside the precinct, but across the entire city. Local news outlets picked up the footage. Talk shows were discussing it. Social media was flooded with clips and comments, hashtags calling for justice, for reform, for accountability. People were angry, not just at Rickson, but at the silence that had let him stay on the job for so long. Jerome sat in a conference room with Evelyn and a few trusted officers. The blinds were closed. The mood was heavy, but focused. A thick file sat open in front of him, full of records, complaints, and reports with familiar patterns. Same neighborhoods, same language, same officer name printed again and again. Rickson wasn't the only one. He was just the one who got caught. Officer Malik, a younger officer from patrol, sat across from Jerome, flipping nervously through the documents. "Sir, I've been on calls with him," he said, voice quiet. "There were things I didn't feel right about, but I didn't think I could speak up. He had seniority. Everyone looked the other way." He rubbed the back of his neck. "We've all seen it. The looks he gave people. The way he changed his tone when he saw who was behind the wheel." Jerome nodded slowly. "And how many times did you file a report?" Malik hesitated. "None, sir. I didn't think it would go anywhere." His words hung in the air like a confession. Evelyn leaned forward. "That's not your failure, Malik. That's the system's. But silence adds to the damage. From this point on, if you see something, you report it. I don't care if it's a lieutenant or a rookie. Understood?" Malik nodded, eyes steady now. "Yes, ma'am." Jerome looked around the table at the other officers. Men and women who had worked under him, with him, sometimes against him without even knowing it. This isn't about destroying careers, he said. It's about rebuilding trust. People need to know this department doesn't just protect its own. It protects what's right. He paused. If we can't face what's wrong in our own house, we can't expect the community to trust the front door. Evelyn shifted to a new file. You need to see this. She handed him a report from 2 years ago. A man named Clarence Williams stopped late at night for a broken taillight. Rickson's name was all over the report. Williams had been pulled from the car, roughed up, cuffed in front of his teenage son. No charges were filed, no body cam footage submitted. The complaint was buried, labeled unsubstantiated. Jerome closed the folder slowly. We find Clarence, he said, and every name after his. They deserve to be heard. Meanwhile, Rickson was holed up in his apartment, blinds shut tight. He hadn't answered any calls since the footage leaked. His phone had exploded with messages, some from friends, most from reporters, and a few from numbers he didn't recognize, but didn't want to answer. He felt like the walls were closing in. Every sound outside made him flinch. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Everything was slipping. His brother Daryl showed up unannounced, knocking hard. When Rickson opened the door, Daryl's face was already full of disappointment. What the hell were you thinking? He asked, stepping inside. You arrested the chief. You didn't even recognize your own boss. Rickson threw his hands up. He looked like a damn vagrant. What was I supposed to do? Just let him sleep on public property? Daryl stared at him. You didn't see the man. You saw his skin, his coat, and you made a choice. One you've probably made 100 times. Rickson's mouth tightened. I was doing my job. No, Daryl snapped. You were doing what you thought the badge gave you permission to do. And now the world sees you for who you are. Rickson sank onto the couch, breathing heavy. They want to ruin me. You ruined yourself, Daryl said. And maybe now you'll finally learn what that feels like. Back at the precinct, Jerome stood outside in the cool night air, watching the station lights flicker across the parking lot. A reporter waited across the street, camera crew in place. They didn't approach yet, just waited. He wasn't ready to speak to them, not until everything was in place, not until every stone had been turned over. But he wasn't going to hide either. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his coat gone, his posture upright. He had worn that disguise for weeks, no badge, no protection, just a man walking through his own city like he had nothing. And in those quiet nights, he had seen the truth, the fear in people's eyes, the way they crossed the street when they saw flashing lights, the way they held their breath during a simple stop. Now he carried their voices. And he wasn't going to stop until every one of them was heard. The next morning, the city woke up to headlines that weren't easy to ignore. Every major news outlet had Jerome's face on the front page, not in uniform, but sitting on that courthouse bench, hood up, surrounded by flashing police lights. The contrast between that image and the headlines beneath it told the whole story. Undercover chief arrested by own officer in alleged racial profiling incident. Inside the precinct, no one was moving like normal. The station wasn't loud, it wasn't rushed. It was quiet. Officers huddled in corners, speaking in low tones. Some sat staring at the monitors showing local news broadcasts, the footage playing again and again. Rickson's face was everywhere. His voice, his words, his actions. They were all replayed for the public. There was no editing, no context to soften the blow. It was raw, and it was damning. In the internal conference room, Jerome stood at the front of a long table, looking out over a full room of officers, sergeants, captains, lieutenants. Some had worked with him for years. Some barely knew him. But they were all there, waiting to hear what would come next. The department had gone silent long enough. It was time to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was steady, and every word landed like it had weight. You saw the footage. You've read the reports. What happened last night wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of this department, of this culture, of the things we've ignored for too long. He paused, his gaze scanning the room. No one looked away. I've walked this city without a badge, without a title. I've seen what people see when they look at us. Fear, silence, distrust. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table. These are the reopened complaints tied to Rickson. But it won't stop there. We're launching a full review of field conduct, stop history, and use of force cases for the past 5 years. Every file, every name, every voice that got buried under red tape. He looked directly at Captain Melvin, a veteran in the department with 3 decades of service. If anyone in this room feels uncomfortable with that, there's the door. But I promise you, this house is getting cleaned. No one moved. Outside that room, reporters gathered at the front of the station. The city had questions. What happened? What was being done? Who else was involved? Deputy Chief Evelyn held the press conference with firm control. We acknowledge the failure. We own the responsibility. The officer involved is suspended pending further investigation. The chief will be speaking publicly in the coming days. Back in the city, the ripple effect had already begun. Community groups, civil rights advocates, even school leaders were speaking out. Some expressed cautious hope. Others didn't trust the sudden shift. One woman, a youth counselor named Leona, stood outside the station with a crowd of parents and students. This isn't the first time someone in power says they're going to fix things, Hornertown, she told a reporter. The difference is, this time, we saw it for ourselves. Meanwhile, Jerome sat in his office for the first time since everything came out. The nameplate on the desk still looked too polished, like it hadn't seen enough dust. He picked up a stack of complaint forms and began reading. Faces, names, stories. People who had walked into the station with shaking hands and left with silence. He read each line like it belonged to someone he knew, because in a way, it did. Evelyn entered quietly, holding a printout. It's spreading fast, she said. The mayor's office wants to meet. Civilian Review Board too. And Internal Affairs says more names are starting to come forward. People who were afraid before, they're talking now. Jerome nodded, not looking up from the file. Good, let them talk. And this time, we'll listen. Back at Rickson's apartment, things were falling apart. His mailbox was full. His phone rang nonstop. Someone had leaked his home address online, and protesters had gathered outside the building. His neighbors avoided him. His landlord had already asked him to consider moving on quietly. He sat on the edge of his couch, unshaven, eyes red from sleeplessness, staring at the same loop of news coverage. He couldn't escape his own face. He tried to call a friend at the union, but they didn't answer. Tried calling his old partner, straight to voicemail. Tried calling his captain, number blocked. Everyone was gone. One decision, one morning, and the years of backing, of brothers in uniform, of unspoken loyalty, it all vanished. In that moment, Rickson wasn't thinking about justice. He wasn't thinking about Jerome or the department. He was thinking about the sound of those cuffs unlocking and the quiet way Jerome had looked at him. No hate, no shouting, just that stare, like he already knew how it would all end, and now Rickson finally understood why. The following day brought gray skies and scattered rain, a quiet backdrop to a city that was anything but calm. The temperature had dropped, but tension on the streets stayed warm, sharp, and rising. In neighborhoods across the city, conversations were no longer whispered. They were loud, public, and angry. People who had never spoken out about police conduct were now speaking without hesitation. Shop owners, teachers, fathers, mothers, teenagers. The silence that had protected men like Rickson for years was finally breaking. Inside the station, Jerome stood in the evidence room alone. Rows of shelves lined the walls, full of cases both active and forgotten. He walked between them slowly, reading the old labels, stopping every now and then when a name caught his attention. Some of those names were in the files he had already read. People who had filed complaints and never received a callback, people who had been stopped, searched, or bruised and told it was routine. He knew better now. Routine had become an excuse. Evelyn found him there, standing in front of a sealed cardboard box marked with a case number and a date from 3 years ago. I knew this one, Jerome said, his voice low. 16 years old. He got stopped walking home from school. Bag searched, phone broken, bruises on his shoulder. He filed a report. You know what the result was? He turned to face her. Unsubstantiated. Officer didn't remember the stop. No body cam footage available. Evelyn crossed her arms. Was it Rickson? Jerome nodded. And no one said a word. He placed a hand on the box. Because a kid's word wasn't enough. They walked back to his office, where stacks of reports were growing taller by the hour. His secretary, Nora, stopped him in the hallway. "You've got 3 meetings waiting: mayor's rep, civilian board, and a group from the community council. And reporters, about 20 of them outside." She lowered her voice. "And sir, the governor's office just called. They want to send a public message about department reform." Jerome sighed and glanced at the clock. It was barely noon. "Tell them I'll meet with them in order of damage caused." Nora blinked. "Which means community first, then the board, then the mayor's people. Reporters can wait, and the governor can send an email." As the day went on, the station began to shift. Officers who had never spoken about department culture were now stepping forward. Malik returned with 3 others, 2 patrol officers and 1 detective, each holding their own reports, stories, names. Some were minor incidents, some serious, but all pointed to the same truth. Rickson hadn't acted alone. He had been encouraged by silence, enabled by inaction, protected by a system that only cared about numbers, not people. Jerome listened to every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush them, just sat at the head of the long table, taking notes, asking questions. Every detail mattered, every ignored report, every overlooked complaint. He wasn't building a case against one man. He was exposing an entire structure, one brick at a time. "I didn't come here to talk about Officer Rickson," he began. "This is bigger than him. This is about a system that allowed men like him to act without fear of consequences. I walk these streets dressed like someone this department often ignores. I was treated like a threat before I even spoke. And I saw what many of you have been saying for years, what you've lived, feared, and fought alone." He looked at the cameras. "To the people we failed, I hear you. And I will not protect anyone who wears this badge without respect for what it means. From today forward, every complaint will be answered, every voice will be recorded, and every officer will be held to the same standard, no matter how long they've worn the uniform." The crowd erupted into applause. Some clapped, some cried, and some just stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to believe that this time would be different. But one thing was certain: Jerome had changed the conversation. He hadn't begged for forgiveness. He hadn't made promises with no weight. He had owned what happened, and now he was holding the door open for justice to walk through. Back in his apartment, Rickson sat on the floor in the dark. His phone lay face down on the table. The sound of Jerome's speech came through the TV across the room, but he didn't mute it. He just stared ahead, numb, listening to the very man he had tried to humiliate now standing in front of the city, backed by thousands. There was no uniform to protect him now, no badge, no shield, just his name and the trail it left behind. 2 days later, the precinct received a visitor no one expected. Clarence Williams, the man from the reopened file Jerome had read days earlier, the one who'd been dragged out of his car in front of his son for a busted taillight, stood silently in the lobby, clutching a manila folder. He wasn't angry when he walked in. He was tired, the kind of tired that sat deep in the bones, built over years of being ignored. He didn't ask to speak to anyone specific. He just said, "I heard someone's finally listening." Nora led him straight to Jerome's office, where he sat with Evelyn, sorting through incident files with red markings and handwritten notes from citizens whose stories had never reached the surface. When Clarence walked in, Jerome stood up immediately. He didn't offer his hand. He just gave a small nod, respectful, acknowledging the weight Clarence carried. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Jerome said softly. Clarence sat down across from him, placing the folder on the desk. "You don't know me," he replied, "but I've known your name for a long time. I used to believe it didn't matter what kind of chief sat in that office. The system was too heavy, too slow. But now, I figured if someone's going to read this," he tapped the folder, "it should be you." Jerome opened it carefully. Inside were photos, medical records, letters from Clarence's employer explaining why he lost his job after missing too many days to recover from injuries. Drawings from his son, crayons and broken lines showing a police car, a man in handcuffs, and a boy watching from the sidewalk. Jerome took a slow breath. His hands didn't shake, but his heart did. Clarence didn't want revenge. He didn't want money. He just wanted his truth to be written down somewhere. It couldn't be erased. "I filed the complaint because I thought it mattered," he said. "But when nobody called back, I told myself to forget it. I told my son the world just works like that. That was the worst part." Lying to him. Jerome leaned forward, his voice steady. "You won't be ignored again. We're reinvestigating your case. And your son's drawing? That's going into training materials. Every officer will see it before they touch a badge." Clarence looked down for a moment, then he nodded. "That's something." After Clarence left, Jerome didn't speak for a long time. Evelyn sat across from him, silent too. The folder remained open on the desk. "There's 100 more like him," she said quietly. Jerome nodded. "And we'll meet them all." Meanwhile, Rickson had left the apartment for the first time in days. A hoodie covered his face, his cap pulled low. He walked the streets like a man on the run, not from the law, but from the memory of who he used to be. He tried to buy coffee at a small corner shop, but the girl behind the counter glanced up, paused, and slowly turned away to let her coworker take the order. He knew what that pause meant. She recognized him. He left the shop without saying a word. His name had become a warning. In online threads, in community forums, on neighborhood watch pages. People used to call the police when they were afraid. Now they warned each other about the police, about officers like Rickson. His legacy was no longer built on citations and arrests. It was built on silence, broken trust, and a man in a hoodie sitting alone in a cafe, watching the city try to heal from the damage he left behind. Later that night, Jerome visited the city park, the one that sat just behind the courthouse, where he had first been picked up by Rickson. The same bench was still there, empty now, cold from the evening air. He sat on it for a moment, the streetlight casting long shadows. The sound of passing cars hummed in the background. A bus rolled by, slowing at the corner, then pulling away. He stared ahead, hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel powerful. He felt the same way he had that morning in cuffs. Quiet, centered, aware of how fast the world could judge a man by the clothes on his back instead of the content in his story. Evelyn joined him minutes later, standing behind the bench. "They want you on national news," she said. "Every network's calling." Jerome shook his head. "Not yet. The story isn't finished, and I'm not the one they should be looking at." She waited a moment, then asked, "Then who?" He stood slowly, brushing off his coat. "The people who didn't fight back, the ones who walked away in silence, the ones whose names aren't in headlines." He turned toward the courthouse. "That's who this story belongs to." And as he walked away from the bench that once held him in handcuffs, the city behind him didn't feel heavier. It felt ready. Ready for a reckoning that had waited too long. Ready for a department to finally be forced to look itself in the mirror. Ready for the silence to end. For good. By the end of the week, Jerome's office was flooded. Not just with paperwork, but with people. Citizens began showing up unannounced, some holding letters, others with nothing but memory and pain. They weren't there for handouts. They weren't there to shout. They came because word had spread that the door was finally open, that someone inside the station was listening and not turning their story into a number. A single mother named Gloria came with her teenage son, Darnell. She held a photograph in her hand, her boy at 13, shirt torn, lip bleeding, standing beside a squad car. "It was supposed to be a warning," she told Jerome, her voice flat. "But you don't scare a child like that and call it protection." Darnell sat beside her, older now, quieter, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. "He never spoke about that day again," she said, "but I know it changed him. The way he walks in stores, the way he stiffens when he sees a patrol car. That's not just fear. That's something broken." Jerome didn't interrupt. He let her speak until there was nothing left but silence. Then he nodded, slid a pen and paper across the desk. "Write down everything you remember. Times, names, even small details. We'll look into it." Gloria didn't cry. She just picked up the pen with hands that trembled slightly and began writing. Outside the office, Evelyn had begun organizing a task force. Half detectives, half civilians, all working under a single mission. Review, respond, rebuild. They called it the accountability wing, and it operated out of what used to be a long-forgotten training room. Now the walls were lined with whiteboards, pinned statements, maps of the city marked with red dots showing reported misconduct. In that room, Jerome stood at the head of a meeting, surrounded by faces from every part of the community: youth advocates, legal volunteers, neighborhood organizers, retired officers who had grown tired of keeping their mouths shut. "This isn't just a department review," Jerome said. "It's a truth audit. We aren't looking at paperwork. We're looking at people. Stories that were pushed aside now come first. I want every officer reviewed, every complaint matched with a response, and I want it done right." The group moved fast. Some combed through thousands of log stops, searching for patterns. Others interviewed citizens who had once been denied access to records. Jerome personally handled every high-risk case, especially those connected to Rickson. One of them involved an older man named Carlton Booker. He had been stopped 3 times in 1 month while walking to his night shift job at the hospital. Every time by Rickson. No arrests, no citations, just stops, questions, flashlights in his face, pat-downs. Once he had shown his employee badge, and Rickson had thrown it on the ground. "Didn't look real to me," he'd said. Carlton never filed a report. He thought no one would care. When Carlton sat in front of Jerome now, his voice cracked on the first sentence. "I got grandkid," he said, "and I don't want them growing up thinking they gotta shrink themselves to survive." Jerome didn't speak. He just reached across the table and placed a printed document in front of him. Carlton leaned forward. It was his case. A report. Investigated. Acknowledged. Validated. "This is yours," Jerome said, "and we'll add it to the official misconduct file. That officer will answer for what he did to you." Carlton exhaled, a shaky, painful release. "You don't know what this means to me," he said. Jerome nodded. "I think I do." But not everyone inside the department supported the changes. Behind closed doors, murmurs had started to rise. Officers who felt threatened. Senior staff who thought Jerome's efforts were too aggressive. Anonymous notes appeared in mail slots, comments scribbled on reports, suggestions that the department's reputation was being dragged through the mud by its own chief. One message typed with no signature had been left on Jerome's desk. "You're tearing the department apart, not building it up." Jerome read it, folded it, and placed it in his drawer without a word. He wasn't surprised. Change never came without friction. But what mattered now wasn't comfort, it was truth, the kind that left no room for hiding. Later that evening, while walking through the station's back hallway, Jerome passed by the Wall of Honor, framed photos of chiefs from years past. He stopped for a moment, staring at the line of faces. All of them white, all of them staring back with cold expressions, proud posture, untouched by scandal. His own frame hadn't been added yet. It waited still unmounted in Nora's office. He touched the edge of one frame, then let his hand fall. His voice, though quiet, carried in the empty hallway. "Let mine hang after the work is done." Not before. And as he turned and walked away, the echoes of his footsteps followed, a steady rhythm that marked the beginning of something the city had never seen before. Not just a cleanup, not just a scandal, a reckoning, a rewriting. And it was only halfway through. By the second week, what started as a local department shakeup had grown into a statewide conversation. City councils in neighboring counties began asking questions about their own complaint systems. Former officers, retired years ago, started speaking out about pressure to stay silent when misconduct happened in their squads. One even went live on a late-night broadcast, holding up a journal filled with years of entries about corruption, favoritism, and quiet cover-ups. Jerome watched the broadcast from the edge of his office couch, not out of surprise but out of confirmation. Every day another piece of the wall cracked. But as the outside world erupted with new revelations, Jerome's internal focus remained steady. He hadn't come for headlines. He came for justice. The accountability wing had turned into a hive of activity. What was once a forgotten training room now looked like a war room. Rows of desks, laptops open, coffee cups stacked, printers running nonstop. Whiteboards lined with timelines, officer histories, cross-linked complaints, photos of victims, statements written in their own handwriting. scans of old case files with faded ink and missing pages. It looked messy, but it was alive. Every morning, Jerome walked into that room and gave assignments. He didn't delegate everything. He still took cases himself, still sat face to face with the people whose pain had been filed away like they were just another task to close. One of those people was a woman named Alma Jenkins. She was in her 70s, a retired teacher who had never stepped inside a police station unless she was paying a parking ticket. 2 years ago, she had reported a break-in at her home. Nothing major was taken, just a broken window, a few drawers rifled through. But when the responding officer arrived, it wasn't concern he brought. It was doubt. She remembered how he looked around her home like he didn't believe she lived there. How he asked questions that had nothing to do with the crime, her income, her children, who bought the furniture. How he looked at her bookshelves like he was searching for a lie. "I stopped calling after that," she told Jerome, sitting across from him. "Even when I heard strange noises. Even when someone slashed my tires, I just stopped." Jerome leaned forward. "Do you remember his name?" She did. She remembered every syllable. Rickson. Her case was added to the growing file. But Alma stayed longer. She asked if she could volunteer, help read statements, organize files, do anything. "I've spent most of my life trying to teach kids to speak up," she said. "Feels wrong not to help now that someone's finally listening." Jerome gave her a desk the next day, but the resistance inside the department wasn't fading, it was growing. Whispers had become closed-door meetings, anonymous emails turned into full-blown accusations. A few officers began claiming the accountability wing was a witch hunt. Some called Jerome the politician in a chief's uniform. A small group of them, mostly older, rank-heavy, began filing union-backed concerns. They argued that Jerome's methods were damaging morale, creating fear among good officers, and eroding respect for the badge. The union president, Officer Ray Dempsey, requested a private meeting. They sat in Jerome's office, the air between them thick with tension. Dempsey was direct. "You've got officers afraid to make traffic stops, afraid to write citations. They think one wrong move and their careers are over." Jerome didn't flinch. "If they're afraid to do their job properly, maybe they never should have worn the badge to begin with." Dempsey narrowed his eyes. "You keep pushing like this, we'll have walkouts. We'll lose staff." Jerome stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked down at the protest signs held outside. "Justice inside first. My voice was ignored. Fix the rot." He didn't turn around when he spoke. "Then let them leave. I'd rather rebuild this department from the ground up with 10 good officers than keep 100 who wear the badge like armor instead of honor." Dempsey didn't say another word. He stood and left. Later that night, Jerome received a message on his private line. No caller ID. Just a robotic voice. "You're making enemies. Be careful where you walk." Then silence. He didn't report it. He didn't call Evelyn. He just sat alone at his desk, the lamp casting a soft glow on the open files in front of him. A photo of Alma's house, Darnell's drawing, Clarence's police report, Carlton's hospital badge, all faces, all moments that had been dismissed, forgotten. He reached for a pen, signed his initials on 3 new case reviews, and whispered to no one in particular. They should have sent that message years ago, before all this. And with that, he returned to work. Because warnings didn't scare him, but silence did. And he wasn't going to let it return. Not on his watch. Not again. The pressure was boiling. Inside the department, outside on the streets, and far beyond city borders. News vans now stayed parked outside the precinct like permanent fixtures. Journalists rotated shifts, hoping to catch fresh statements, new names, or another explosive headline. Every few hours, someone would knock at Jerome's office door, sometimes with a document, sometimes with a story, sometimes with a threat wrapped in polite suggestion. Despite it all, Jerome never missed his morning walk through the precinct. He didn't do it for appearances. He did it to look his officers in the eye, to let them feel the weight of his presence. Not everyone nodded back. Some turned their backs. A few looked down. But every day, more of them started meeting his gaze. Not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect. On one of those mornings, a rookie named Adam approached him in the hallway, nervous. "Sir, can I speak with you for a second?" Jerome stopped. The kid couldn't have been more than 24. Of course. Adam pulled out a folded note and handed it over. This was slid under my locker. I didn't want to just ignore it. Jerome opened the paper slowly. The handwriting was rushed, jagged. Keep your mouth shut or you'll be off the streets for good. No name, no signature. Just a warning, one more added to a growing pile. Jerome nodded, pocketed the note, and looked the young officer in the eye. You did the right thing. Keep doing your job. Keep your camera on. And don't let fear write your decisions. Adam nodded back, his jaw clenched a little tighter, a little firmer than before. Back in the accountability wing, a new file had landed on Evelyn's desk. Thick, unmarked, just labeled confidential. Inside were copies of emails, audio transcripts, and interdepartmental memos, most dating back over 6 years. The contents were devastating. Documentation of how certain complaints had been intercepted before reaching internal affairs. Patterns showing how specific names were red flagged and redirected. And worse, lists of citizens who were quietly marked as frequent liars after repeated reports against the same officers. The name Rickson appeared over 32 times. Evelyn called Jerome in immediately. He read in silence for 15 straight minutes. No interruptions, no reaction, until the final page. It was a printed email, short, from a previous watch commander, now retired, advising the internal team to close any unnecessary cases from what he called neighborhood troublemakers to keep the department's image clean. At the bottom was a handwritten note from someone anonymous. They knew. They always knew. Jerome leaned back, exhaling through his nose, not in shock, but in realization. We were never just dealing with a bad officer, he said slowly. We were dealing with a culture that planned its silence. That night, he called a citywide town hall, held in the old community center downtown. It was packed beyond capacity. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. Dozens more watched on screens outside. Inside, you could feel the heat, not just from the bodies, but from the decades of frustration filling the room. Citizens brought folders, photos, recordings, some of them yellowed with age. Generations of pain stood in that room. Young men in hoodies beside elders with walking canes, single mothers next to ministers, bus drivers beside lawyers. Jerome stood on the stage with no barrier between him and the crowd, no podium, just a microphone and an open floor. I'm not here to defend what's been done, he began. I'm here to admit that it happened, that it kept happening, and that it never should have. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He continued, we found records, real records, of how reports were filtered out, citizens blacklisted, and stories buried under paperwork. Not one or two mistakes, a system of silence. Someone from the crowd shouted, so what now? Jerome didn't pause. Now we rebuild. Together. We reopen every complaint that was ever marked unresolved. We allow citizen oversight. We require public access to officer conduct reports. We place community members in hiring panels. And we open up new avenues for youth training, where kids from every neighborhood can sit in on policy sessions and tell us what policing feels like to them. Another voice called out, why should we trust you? He looked out across the room, steady. Don't trust me. Trust what I put in place. Judge me by the actions, not the badge. And if I fail you, don't go quiet again. Make noise, loud enough that no one ever dares to ignore it. Applause didn't come immediately, but then it did. From the back, then the middle, then the sides. People didn't just clap. Some stood, some cried, some held up phones, recording the moment. Not as a show, but as proof. A man in a badge, not above the people, but standing among them. Outside, Evelyn watched from near the vans, her phone buzzing nonstop with press inquiries. She didn't answer. Not yet. Because this wasn't about sound bites. This was about something most people never got from a system like theirs. Acknowledgement. Action. A chance to finally believe that things might, just might, change. And at the center of it all stood Jerome. Not untouchable, not flawless, but accountable. And for this city, that was the rarest kind of justice. 3 weeks in, and the weight of the transformation was no longer something felt only in meetings or seen in headlines. It was visible on the streets. For the first time in years, foot patrols were walking differently. Officers moved slower, not from laziness, but from caution, from thoughtfulness. The old bark of commands had softened into conversations. And most noticeable of all, body cams, once treated like burdens, were being activated without reminders. But change brought consequences. Inside the precinct, a growing divide had settled like an invisible crack down the middle. On one side were the officers who supported Jerome's mission, who welcomed the change, who believed the past needed to be reckoned with. On the other were the resentful, the angry, those who felt exposed, betrayed. Some had been quiet contributors to the silence. Others were just too comfortable with how things used to be. Whispers of transfer requests started piling up. Some simply stopped showing up for work, calling out sick, waiting to see if the storm would pass. It wasn't passing. One afternoon, Jerome held a closed-door meeting with every ranking officer still willing to sit across from him. There were 23 chairs around the table. Only 14 were filled. He stood at the head, files in front of him, some thick, some thin. This table, he began, used to be filled with officers who made decisions based on fear. Fear of bad press, fear of being wrong, fear of their own shadows. I want leaders who make decisions based on truth, even when it hurts. Captain Reeves, a longtime officer who'd once worked alongside Rickson, shifted in his chair. Respectfully, sir, we're losing control. Morale is down. Officers feel like they're under attack. Some don't even want to respond to calls. Jerome nodded. Then maybe they shouldn't be wearing a uniform. Reeves flinched. You're turning this place upside down. Jerome stepped closer. Number, I'm turning it right side up. You're just not used to seeing it that way. There was a long silence. Then a hand raised from the end of the table. It was Sergeant Molina, one of the youngest in the room. Sir, she said, I don't think this is about morale. I think it's about guilt, about officers finally realizing that silence was a kind of action. And now they have to look in the mirror and face what they let happen. Jerome gave a small nod. She's right. The question is, who among you is ready to lead in truth? And who is only here because the chair hasn't been pulled out from under you yet? Not one person spoke. He didn't need them to. After the meeting, Jerome walked back to his office. On his desk sat a new envelope. No return name. Inside, a printed transcript. It was a recording between Rickson and another officer, dated 3 months before the undercover incident. The file had been slipped through internal systems anonymously. The conversation was chilling. Rickson, man, you stop one of them, and they all start crying foul, like they're all saints. Unknown officer, just do the paperwork and move on. Rickson, please, you think anyone upstairs cares? Long as the reports are clean, I could plant a toaster in the back seat and still walk away. Unknown officer, you're not wrong. Jerome read the transcript twice, not because he didn't believe it, but because it confirmed everything he already knew. The confidence in Rickson's voice, the ease with which he joked about corruption, the assumption that no one was watching. He placed the transcript in the misconduct file, now thick enough to snap a rubber band. But that wasn't the worst of it. That evening, Evelyn walked into his office with a strained look. You need to see this, she said, handing him a phone. On the screen played a video. It was Rickson, recorded in a dim room, sitting with a man across the table. The video had been leaked to a small underground blog. In it, Rickson spoke openly. I was made the scapegoat, he said. I was following what the job trained me to do. Profile, control, dominate. They trained us to believe fear was the weapon, and they liked that I could use it well. But then the chief pulls some trick, plays dress up, and suddenly I'm the villain? The man behind the camera asked, Are you saying you were set up? Rickson leaned forward, voice bitter. I'm saying I did what they all do. I just got caught doing it to the wrong man. The video ended. Jerome stared at the screen for a long time. Not because of the lie, but because of the truth buried inside it. Rickson wasn't wrong about one thing. He wasn't the only one doing it. He was just the one who did it to someone with the power to answer back. Evelyn broke the silence. Do we respond? Jerome shook his head. Number, let it sit. Let people hear it. Let them hear what arrogance sounds like when it's cornered. That night, as the precinct lights dimmed and most of the building emptied out, Jerome stayed behind. He stood in front of the large whiteboard in the accountability wing. Written at the top were two columns, reported and resolved. Under reported, dozens of names, incidents, locations. Under resolved, only a fraction. He picked up the marker and added a new line to the board. Date, today. Name, anonymous. Type, internal leak. Status, under review. Then he capped the pen, stepped back, and looked at the board like a battlefield map. Outside, the rain started again. Not loud, not angry, just steady, cleansing. And inside, Jerome remained in the glow of the whiteboard, determined to keep going. Not until the system looked good on paper, but until the people who once feared it could finally stand in front of it without shaking. The following morning began not with a meeting, but with a knock. Not from an officer, not from a reporter. This knock came from a boy. Barely 13, slim, eyes too old for his age, he stood at the front desk holding a letter, his hand clutching it so tight the paper had started to wrinkle. Nora spotted him first. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice softening. The boy looked up, his mouth trembling. "I need to give this to the chief. It's for him. My brother told me to bring it." Nora took the envelope, concerned. "Is your brother okay?" The boy shrugged, eyes distant. "He's in county jail. Said maybe now somebody would care." She led him to Jerome's office herself. Jerome was standing by the window when they arrived. He turned and noticed the boy immediately, the way he stood slightly behind Nora, like he wasn't sure he belonged. "Come in," Jerome said gently. "You can sit if you want." The boy didn't sit. He stepped forward and held out the envelope. "My brother's name is Eric. He told me what happened to him. It's not right, and you're the only one who might listen." Jerome took the envelope with both hands, treating it with the same weight he would a sworn affidavit. Inside was a handwritten letter. The ink had smudges in places, as if written with shaking hands. Eric described being pulled over last year by 3 officers, including Rickson. They said his brake light was out. It wasn't. Within minutes, he was face down on the pavement, knee in his back, his phone shattered on the ground. He wasn't armed, wasn't resisting. They said he fit a description. They found nothing, but they held him for 6 hours without charge. When he asked why, Rickson laughed and said, "You'll forget this in a few days. You people always do." Jerome didn't blink. He read every word. When he finished, he looked at the boy. "Did your brother tell you to bring this yourself?" The boy nodded. "He said if he sent it through the system, they'd lose it." Jerome understood. That wasn't paranoia. That was history. He stood, walked around the desk, and crouched so he was eye level with the boy. "Thank you. What you did today matters, and I promise, I won't let this be buried." The boy nodded. His eyes didn't cry, but Jerome saw the storm behind them. After he left, Jerome called Evelyn in. "We're adding Eric to the case group, and I want every officer on that stop pulled for review. Full file, all stops made that month." Evelyn sat across from him, eyes tense. "Sir, the board's pushing back. They're saying this investigation is expanding too fast, going too deep. There's talk of freezing your authority, appointing a transition review committee." Jerome sighed. "Of course they are," she continued. "They're accusing you of running the department like an activist instead of a chief, that you're trying to shame the badge, not restore it." Jerome walked to the board again. The list underreported had grown. The markers were running low. The wall wasn't big enough anymore. He picked up the black one. "I'm not here to shame the badge," he said quietly. "I'm here to make it mean something again." That afternoon, the city council scheduled an emergency hearing. Officially, it was to evaluate the impact of recent departmental actions. Unofficially, it was an attempt to corner Jerome, make him answer for the disruption, for the headlines, for the whispers coming from the union halls and the political backrooms. Cameras lined the walls. Microphones hovered over every desk. Members of the public packed the rows. When Jerome walked in, the room shifted. He didn't wear his full uniform, no medals, no fanfare. Just the standard issue dress shirt with the nameplate, Chief Langston. The first question was sharp. "Chief, do you believe your department is broken?" He answered without pause. "I believe it's wounded, deeply, and wounds that go untreated become rot. I'm choosing to cut out the rot." Another question came. "Are you targeting specific officers unfairly?" "Number, I'm investigating patterns. And if those patterns lead to names, so be it." Someone tried to trap him. "You think you're the only one who can fix this?" He smiled, not with arrogance, but with resolve. "Number, I'm just the first one who refused to keep pretending it wasn't broken." The room was quiet. Some of the council members shifted in their seats. Not everyone liked his tone, but it was hard to argue with the truth when it was sitting in a pile of reopened case files, victim statements, and audio evidence. Later that evening, Jerome walked home alone. No driver, no escort, just the sound of his shoes on the concrete and the echo of a city in transition. As he passed a corner where once he saw a young boy get searched for no reason, he noticed something new. A mural, not of him, but of names, first names only, painted by children and community artists. Some names had ages beside them. Others had short words, teacher, uncle, daughter. At the bottom in bold paint were the words, "We remember because they forgot." He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the wall. The wind picked up, but for the first time in weeks it didn't carry weight. It carried promise. A month had passed since Jerome had been dragged off a courthouse bench in handcuffs by one of his own officers. A month since the cameras caught it, the city watched it, and the department flinched. 30 days of reckoning, 30 days of stories unearthed, names re-examined, and silence finally split open. But the work wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Inside the precinct, the accountability wing had outgrown its space. It now spanned 2 rooms and operated like a second nerve center. Civilian volunteers worked side by side with sworn officers. The line between uniform and community was still there, but thinner, softer. Trust hadn't been rebuilt, but the scaffolding was finally rising. Jerome stood near the center table, scanning a wall filled with color-coded cards. Green for resolved, yellow for open, red for delayed. The red ones still outnumbered the others. He didn't need anyone to say it. He felt the weight of each one. Behind him, Evelyn entered with fresh updates. "We've officially reopened 87 closed complaints. 43 have been resolved with disciplinary action. 21 officers are under formal review. 12 have resigned. 5 cases moved to criminal investigation. 3 civil suits filed. And," she paused, "Rickson's hearing is set for next Friday." Jerome gave a small nod. He didn't react the way most would expect. No relief, no triumph, just that same calm, steady focus. "He'll try to play the victim," he said. "He'll say the system made him what he became." He picked up a card from the board. But choices were still made. By him. By the ones who trained him. By the ones who turned away when they saw him break rules. Everyone shares the blame. Evelyn stepped forward, softer now. "And what about you? What happens when this is over?" Jerome stared at the board for a moment before answering. "I don't think it's ever over. Not really. But maybe one day the calls I get won't be about the past. Maybe they'll be about what we're building instead." That night, a special community ceremony was held at the city square, a public event to honor the names recovered during the investigation. Victims, survivors, citizens who once stood alone and had now been pulled back into the record. It wasn't political. It wasn't corporate. No press conference. No ribbon. Just people. Standing. Witnessing. A long wall had been built, stretching 50 feet wide, painted a soft gray. On it were the first names of every person whose complaint had been ignored, denied, or buried. No last names. No titles. Just the pieces of humanity the system once chose to overlook. Darnell, the teenage boy who once drew his trauma in crayon, was there. So was Alma, seated in a folding chair wrapped in a warm shawl. Clarence stood with his son, one arm around his shoulder. Carlton from the hospital shift. Gloria. Even Eric's little brother, who had walked into the station weeks ago with a folded letter in his pocket. They weren't just names on paper anymore. They were voices, faces, people with stories that finally had weight. Jerome stood off to the side, not at the front, not holding a mic. He didn't need a spotlight. He had walked this road in silence before. Now it was time for others to speak. A community elder stepped forward and read each name out loud, one by one. The crowd repeated them in unison. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Every syllable was a hammer to the silence. When the last name was read, a long pause filled the air. Then slowly, people began to place candles at the base of the wall, hundreds of tiny lights glowing against the cold stone. Not for mourning, for remembering. Jerome finally stepped forward, not to speak, but to kneel. He placed one candle at the base, and beside it, a folded piece of paper. It was the original arrest report from the day Rickson had cuffed him. Falsified, dismissive, arrogant. On the back, Jerome had written 4 words in clean black ink. The silence ends here. As he stood up, the crowd behind him didn't cheer. They stood with him, quietly, powerfully, together. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't just a department being repaired. It was a city learning to breathe again, to stand straighter, to remember, to hold power accountable, not just once, but always. And at the center of it all was one man, not a savior, not a symbol, just a leader who chose to wear the badge with weight, not comfort. The kind of man they never saw coming, but the kind this city would never forget. If this story touched you or made you think, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next powerful story coming your way.